if this is, yeah, it's on. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Murphy, and I'm here on behalf of the League of Women Voters Falls Church. I have the pleasure of introducing Paul Stoddard and Jack Trainer, who are going to give a 20-minute, about 20-minute presentation on the proposed changes to the transitional zones. After that, they've planned a question and answer session. I'm going to do my best to pass the mic. That's important because we're also live streaming and recording so that folks can view from home. And in order for them to hear your question, you have to be on the mic. So without further ado, I introduce to you Paul Stoddard and Jack Trainer.
Hello, everybody. It is amazing to see so many folks coming out tonight to learn more about the proposal that's on the table, and of course for the opportunity to engage after the presentation, ask questions, get information, hear your thoughts as well. So I'm looking forward to the event, and I'm always excited when there's a big turnout. So thank you for taking the time out of your evening to come here and be a part of this tonight. Um, I should introduce myself. My name is Paul Stoddard. I'm the planning director with the city. I've been here for 9-10 years time, worked on a number of different efforts throughout the city. And one of the things that actually got me into planning in the first place was community engagement. So the opportunity to do this is really sort of a dream of mine. So thank you. With me also is Jack Trainer. He's our case planner on this project. He was actually, he grew up in the city, and so he returned here for his professional career, and we're happy to have him. He's been a great addition to the team. And I'll let him get into the specifics later. But first, I'm going to kick off the presentation with a couple slides on how this effort got started and why the Planning Commission and the City Council wanted to look at T-zones and potential changes. So first slide, why T-zones? So one of the things that was driving the council conversation from the beginning was trying to find a way to get a wider variety of housing in the city. As you'll see in a couple slides, that housing in the city is really dominated by two types of housing. There's single-family housing, and then there's multifamily housing in very large buildings, 2+ acre buildings, 100, 200, 300 units at a time. And so council was looking for a way to get a wider variety of housing. A fallout of that, an outcome of that can be a variety of price points as well as opportunities for home ownership. I'm sure folks have seen the listings for new housing in the city. Single family houses going for 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, $1.8 million. That's a tough entry point for someone to get into the housing market. And so council is looking for ways to make more options available. The other thing, the second bullet here is talking about encouraging reinvestment. So when you think about the city, you've got the commercial corridors, Broad Street, Washington Street, the building we're standing in now. That's been invested in over the last 20 years through the special exception process. And that's been successful in terms of attracting additional investment to the city and seeing new opportunities come. There's also been redevelopment in the single family housing. Most of it is tear down activity with new houses, newer, larger houses going up in its place. There's also been some net new gain of single family housing throughout the city. But T-zones in between the two really haven't seen a similar level of investment. And that means those areas are lagging behind the rest of the city in terms of the aesthetics, the streetscape, the infrastructure. It's through private development that those items typically get updated. And so the lack of investment in T-zones means a lack of community benefits in those areas. And of course, I'm sorry, just the last point. I know I'm dragging on this one, but this is sort of the intro to the whole thing. But the last thing is obviously, as part of achieving those things, there's still an interest in making sure the T-zones serve their city design purpose of being something that's not as big as what's on Broad in Washington, but being something that's a little bit bigger than what's in the single family behind it. This idea of a transition from higher intensity to lower intensity. Why plan for housing? As I said, that was one of the council's primary motivations for getting into the conversation. This is going to start with something of a regional picture, and then the next slide is going to talk about a local picture. But first, just thinking about the importance of housing as a basic human right. The idea of access to affordable housing, safe, decent housing, is a basic principle that's been a cornerstone of the country going back to 1948 when the city signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. and so when you take it as a given that providing people access to housing, not that it's free, but they have the ability to buy into it, then it's important to take into consideration what's going to happen with the regional population. So between 2025, 2045, there's a projected increase in population in the region from 6 million to 6.9 million people. Obviously, those 1 million people are not all going to fit inside the city of Falls Church, and that's certainly not the intent. But as you see this map, it's dotted with these little red dots. Those are called regional activity centers. And this gets to the last point on the slide, this idea of environmental sustainability and development. One of the things that's been talked about at the regional level and signed on to by all the localities in the DC region is this idea of sustainable development. And the way to make it sustainable is by promoting more investment, more housing, more jobs, more activity within these regional activity centers. These are the sort of the known places throughout the region. You think about downtown DC, the Rosenboston corridor, Tysons Falls Church, Vienna, city of Fairfax, these places where you can find a higher concentration of jobs, shopping, housing, schools, all the things people need to do to get through day to day. And so the regional model here is focused development in the regional activity centers. And of course, Falls Church is one of those. And of course, there are local benefits to more housing as well. A lot of it relates to economic development. The need to have more workforce housing within the city when you think about where are the teachers going to live, the firefighters, the police officers, where are they going to live? Where are the folks who are running the grocery stores are going to live? Are there places for them to live inside the city? And then, of course, everyone who lives in the city usually does more local spending inside the city. So for local shops, local restaurants, those all depend a lot, very heavily on local spending dollars. So this is taking that regional conversation and breaking it into a local level. The city's comprehensive plan, this is a document that all localities in Virginia have, and it charts out a community vision for development over the next 20 years. And the city council, as well as the general population, have again and again reaffirmed this idea of a commitment to a growing community, an equitable community, a vibrant community. And a lot of those pieces are underpinned by the availability of housing, the housing chapter of the comprehensive plan, the demographics chapter of the comprehensive plan, all talk about the need to expand the variety of housing within the city. I said it before that I was going to talk about sort of not necessarily an oversupply, but the heavy supply of single-family housing and multifamily housing in comparison to what's in between those things. So this is a summary of housing by type over the last several years in the city. The red bars here represent the number of single-family homes available in the city, just over 2,000, remaining mostly constant but marginally increasing. The gray bars on the top are multifamily, and this shouldn't be that much of a surprise to anyone who's seen the construction cranes around town. And then these blue bars in the middle are those spaces in between where there really hasn't been much change. I think that's probably enough on that slide. What's on the next one? All right, so that's the end of my intro, and now I'm going to turn it over to Jack, who's going to talk about sort of two pieces. One, the procedure for zoning amendment changes, the process that these things go through and the groups that are engaged, as well as the timeline that those things follow. And then the second thing Jack is going to do is break down the specific pieces of what's proposed in these T-zone changes.
Thanks, Paul. And good evening, everyone. My name is Jack Trainer. I'm staff planner at the city. Haven't worked for the city as long as Paul but it's certainly no stranger to me. It's great to see, again, the turnout tonight, so thanks everyone for coming out. Again, I'll be going over the zoning text amendment process and the schedule for the T-zone changes, and then I'll go through specifically what those proposed changes are that's being considered. So the zoning ordinance does allow for changes over time in section 4886 of the code, and the procedural steps are really three, which I'll go over. The first is the council referral, also called a first reading. That referral goes to then the planning commission for deliberation and recommendation back to council on what was referred out. Step 3 is actually, there's two options here. Once the planning commission makes their recommendation to city council, council can then issue a new first reading based on any changes outside of the scope that the original referral had, at which time it goes back to the Planning Commission for a new round of deliberation and public input, and then eventually it'll return to City Council for final consideration and implementation. And of course, each step isn't one meeting, right? We have the dates down here showing kind of the makeup of each of those steps. The council first started considering the T-zone changes in June of 2021 with its initial referral to the Planning Commission in May 23rd of last year. The Planning Commission took it up in June of last year and is scheduled for to make its recommendation to City Council next Wednesday, February 15th. That at its regularly scheduled meeting at City Council chambers, at which point it's anticipated that Council will issue a new first reading back to Planning Commission again, and then we'll start the process kind of over again, so to speak. The Planning Commission will deliberate, have more meetings before it goes back to Council for a final consideration. Okay, and so what are those considerations? Staff has kind of broken them down into 11 buckets, if you will, which I'll go over each in a little more detail here. So the first I'll talk about our residential uses. And actually, I want to highlight that a lot of these slides are going to have this format showing today what's allowed in T-zones, what council referred out, and then the Planning Commission's tentative recommendation. And I want to highlight this as tentative, that the Planning Commission hasn't made their formal recommendation yet, as I just said. That's scheduled to take place next Wednesday. So this is just a tentative recommendation based on their last work session. So let's get into it. Residential uses. Today, single family and duplexes are allowed by right. In the council referral, single family and two families would be removed as allowable uses. And the Planning Commission's, again, tentative recommendation, this would include a grandfather clause for those folks that own single family homes in T-zones that would allow them, for instance, to rebuild their home should it burn down. It would allow them to expand their home. They would keep all the property rights that they're allowed today. So that's what the grandfather clause would allow for. Moving down to townhouses. Townhouses are also allowed by right today, but they're subject to the residential townhouse or RTH zoning district regulations, which requires a 3-acre minimum lot size. In the council referral, townhouses, as well as condos, apartments, would not be by right, but they would be allowable uses under the special use permit or a conditional use. I'll get into what the SUP or special use permit process is in a little bit. And all those uses would only be allowed on sites of 1 acre or less. That's, again, in the council referral. And the Planning Commission's, again, tentative referral or recommendation, townhouses would be an SUP use, again, on sites of 1 acre or less. But dwellings of up to 1 to 4 units would be allowed by right on lots, again, that are 1 acre or less. And that would be based upon the form of the building complying with a residential zone. So not necessarily T-zone, but if the building complies with an R1A or R1B form, as the Planning Commission tentatively recommends, that building would be allowed up to 4 units. And then mixed-use redevelopment through the MUR zoning district, which we note here has only been used once in the city's history, is a by right use today in both the council and Planning Commission referrals and recommendations that would be removed. So next I'll talk about expanded commercial uses. I'm not going to list all of them. I'll just hit the highlights here because you can see there's a lot of different lists here. But today we have the first column here. In council's referral, it removes boarding houses, lodging houses, and rooming houses. as allowable uses and adds clinics for human care, restaurants, and a list of retail and retail service uses. The Planning Commission's recommendation isn't much different, except that it also recommends removing parking lots as principal by right uses. Otherwise, it's the same as council's referral. So building height. I'll look at the chart kind of down here first. For T1 single family and two family uses, the max height right now is 35 feet or 2.5 stories. For townhouses in T1, it's 35 feet or 3 stories. And all other uses in T1 or T2 allows up to 45 feet. What the council and PC recommendation is right now is expanding that max height to 4 stories or 50 feet with 10 foot step backs. And I'll explain what that means. So on the left here, we have a model of what's allowed today for a commercial building. We have 45 feet by right, and then we're showing kind of the pedestrian experience here. So on the street, a pedestrian would, confront a 45-foot building by right, potentially. On the right here shows what the council's proposal is, which is a max height of 50 feet, but that can only be achieved with a 10-foot step back, which comes into play in reference to the building face. So we have the yards kind of that you can see here, the front yard, that has its own regulation, which I'll get to in a minute. You have the 40-foot max height, and then 10 feet back from that building face would be the additional 10 feet, so that a pedestrian would only be interacting at most with a 40-foot building. So setbacks, as I alluded to, different than step backs. Setbacks are the yards that we're talking about, the front yards, the backyards, and side yards that kind of shape the base of the building in relation to the lot dimension. So for T1, two family, we have a front setback of 25 feet, a backyard or rear setback of 30 feet, and a side setback of 10 feet. Again, this is what's allowed today. For T1 townhouses, there's a 25-foot front setback, 40 feet rear setback, and no side setbacks unless it's an end unit. And then for all other uses in both the T1 and T2 districts, you have the 15-foot front setback, no rear setbacks unless it abuts a residential district, and then certain buffers apply. And then a 10-foot side yard setbacks. So in the council referral, there would be a 15-foot front setback, 10-foot rear setback, and a 10-foot side setback. And then in the Planning Commission's, again, tentative proposal, it's much the same with 15-foot front setbacks, 20-foot rear setback instead of the council referred 10, and a side setback of 10 feet. The rest of the districts you see here are for comparison to the T-zone specifically. The first two are other districts in the city, the residential cluster zone and the residential townhouse zone that I mentioned earlier. And then Walla Walla, Washington is included. You might be wondering, it was recently recognized by the American Planning Association for their work on their residential zoning code. And so those regulations are listed here for comparison. And then Montgomery County's CRN zones is also thought to be a transition zone as a nearby jurisdiction. So for lot coverages, we have 3 different ways that we're gonna talk about this here. The first is tree canopy, or the area beneath the vegetation drip line. So as far as the tree canopy extends, everything below that, that's a tree canopy minimum. The pervious surface maximum is all that area on the lot covered by an impervious surface. That includes the house. That could be a driveway, a patio, any impervious surface. And then the building coverage maximum is just that. It's just the maximum amount of the lot that could be covered by a building or a house. So today, there's no language or requirements on tree canopy minimums. Same with the city council referral. In the planning commission's recommendation, that would be a 15% minimum tree canopy coverage. For impervious surface, similarly, there's no restrictions on the impervious surface maximum in T-zones. And the council referral doesn't issue language on that. The planning commission's impervious surface maximum would be 80% of the lot. And the building coverage maximum for T-zones today is 40%. In the council referral, it's 80%. And the planning commission, 60%. So if you built your house the whole 60%, then you'd have 20% more for your driveway and other impervious surfaces to achieve the maximum 80%. Okay, stormwater. There's no specific proposed language currently as it pertains to stormwater. As it would be today, the T-zone developments and redevelopments would follow the city's regulations in Section 35.6 of the code, which speaks to redevelopment or runoff created by redevelopment in both quality and quantity. And essentially for runoff quality, it varies based on the amount of the land that's being disturbed. So for less than 1 acre, the quality has to improve by 10%. For an acre or greater, it has to improve by 20% after the redevelopment. For quantity, essentially the volume of the runoff can't exceed runoff. The new runoff can't exceed the runoff before redevelopment. So it just can't be greater when you're done. Okay, historic preservation. Today, there's the Historic and Cultural Conservation District, which is citywide. It requires the landowner, the property owner of any historic district, when involving their property in a raising application or a redevelopment that would knock the structure down, to first put it on the market at fair market value. And based on whatever that value is, dictates how long the property has to be on the market. That's currently the only historic preservation language as it refers to T-zones. The city council referral maintains the HCC, and the planning commission recommendation does as well, but also adds language encouraging the consideration of applications to incorporate and maintain the structures. Off-street parking requirements. Today, we have listed here the different, by code off-street parking required for different multifamily unit mixes, as well as townhouses and single-family homes. The city council referral does not include specific language on off-street parking requirements. The planning commission recommendation would set required parking minimums at 1 spaces per home flat. And these, we note these two kind of recent mixed-use projects that delivered. 301 West Broad Street has a parking utilization, which is the number of registered cars for the space compared to the spots on site. So a 0.92 spaces per unit is their parking utilization at 301 West Broad Street. And at Lincoln Tinner Hill, that rate is 0.82 spaces per unit. This slide pertains to the kind of different districts as they are right now. There's T1 and T2. I know this map, maybe if I can a little bigger. So I also need to see the language a little bit, the slide. So we have T1 and T2, and they're primarily clustered around North Washington Street and Park. with a couple, other sites throughout the city. The council referral includes a consolidation of the districts to just have one. And yeah, I'm not missing anything there. And then the planning commission would similarly combine the two districts, but include, or again, include some language or provide for some consideration of the differences between the two sites in terms of usages and potentially form. Okay, affordable housing. We're almost done here, folks. Today, there's no affordable housing requirement in T zones. In the city council's referral, 10% of all new homes would have to meet affordable or workforce housing area median income requirements. In the planning commission's recommendation, it's a little different. It proposes replacing the city council's language with a new T-zone overlay that taxes the taxing district that collects all new tax revenue. So whatever the difference is between the property values today versus after redevelopment, that would be captured in a fund that would go towards the supporting and creating affordable housing across the city. And lastly, the last bucket here is the development review process. I know this is kind of there's a lot going on here, so I'll try to break it down. Over here, we have the special exception and special use permit procedures. These apply again to certain conditional uses, so not by right. Special use permit, as proposed, would apply to those uses in T zones that would be allowed on 1 acre or less. The certain residential uses. With the special exception, this is largely meant for larger projects, and you can see it's cut off here a little bit, but it's an 11-month process, so it's longer than the special permit. Sorry. Is that a little better? So the reason, part of the reason that I think that the special use permit is proposed is for these kind of smaller redevelopment projects. And talking to the building community, sometimes it can take upwards of $1 million just to get through such an extensive special exception procedure. So for special use permits for smaller projects, it would cut the procedure down by a couple months, but still allow for public comment, planning commission, and city council review. So after the special exception or special use permit procedure, then the development application would move to the site plan process. And the site plan process applies to any development in the city. So it's a 2-step review process where, again, it would go through the planning commission and certain boards and commissions, and take in the public input and review as well. So to recap, that's kind of the breakdown. I know there's a lot of information, and I'm sure folks have questions, but we we kind of broke down, what the T-zone proposals are, kind of in a nutshell. In 11 different nutshells. And then, again, to kind of reiterate what Mr. Stoddard was saying on why the T-zones are being, considered, it's to help promote diversity in form, in price, and for residential and commercial spaces. To encourage reinvestment in the T-zones, while also allowing for these areas to be harmonious transitions between lighter intensity and higher intensity areas in the city. And lastly, this is my last slide, just to recap the zoning amendment process. Right now, the Planning Commission had their last work session on January 25th. Their public hearing and formal recommendation will be next Wednesday, February 15th. And that's step 2 of the process. And then after that recommendation, it'll go to City Council, again, where it's anticipated that a new first reading will take place, sending it back to the Planning Commission to account for the expanded scope that was referred out initially. So with that, I'll hand the mic back to Ms. Murphy.
Okay, so it sounds like we're ready to open it up for questions. And I'm going to pass the mic to folks in the order that I see their hands raised.
Hello. Director Stoddard, do you want to mention that all these slides are on your website under the agenda?
Saying that, and I'm sorry I didn't say it earlier, all of these slides are posted as part of the Planning Commission's packet materials for their meeting next Wednesday. So if you go to Google, search for Falls Church Planning Commission, you'll be able to find your way to their page, and then the first attachment will be these slides. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm the widow of a D-Day veteran and depend on my home valuation for financial security. My question is the Planning Commission allowed to pick and choose which residents to cater to and which to dismiss from consideration without any explanation? I've heard commissioners recommend changes to the T-zone proposal to make it more appealing for 4 homes on the north side of Park Street between Pennsylvania and North Lee, without considering equal impacts and changes for 23 homes butting up against the south side of the same T-zone parcels. And 7 of those 23 homes can only view T-zone properties. They have all their windows facing those properties.
So first, thank you for the service. Obviously, that means a lot, right? It's the reason a lot of us are here. So are able to be here. So thank you. In terms of the Planning Commission consideration, obviously this is something that goes through a pretty heavy community process. You can see here on the chart the number of work sessions they've held. I know we've been including all the comments that we receive in written form. They've certainly received many comments presented to them live at their meetings. And I think it's a hard job. Planning commissioners, council members, they have to weigh all these inputs and figure it out. I don't think they're ignoring anybody. I do think when they talk about the differences along, say, a Park Avenue or a Washington Street, what they're looking back at is the city's comprehensive plan, the small area plans that describe different characters for these streets. For example, North Washington being predominantly commercial as a future vision, Park Avenue being one of the city's civic great streets. And then, of course, you see the design considerations being taken into account at the individual levels. Actually, Jack, if you could go back to the setbacks slide. So I think this change was actually made specifically because of the comments that came in from folks certainly in the Byron, the Broadway building. This idea of increasing the setbacks over time. You can actually see by right today, a T-zone commercial building could be built strictly on that property line. Council said, wait a second, that's too close, it needs to be 10 feet. Planning Commission said, I'm not even sure 10 feet is enough. And so staff went out, did research. We looked at other comparable districts, whether they were within the region or even award-winning places across the country. Providing that information to the council, they landed on this recommendation of 20 feet, right? So it's 20 feet on one side of the line plus whatever the setback is on the other side of the line as well. So if the other building is 10 feet back, then it's a total of 30 feet between the two. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Let me just make sure I understand the question. So you're asking what are the step backs if it's a residential building versus a commercial building?
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm Nancy Ingressano, and I live at the Broadway. And I believe there, in the current proposal, there's a proposal to reduce the height at the front of the buildings. And there is no consideration to reduce what the back looks like. And the back is facing more homes than the front is. So it seems as though it's not equitable.
Yeah, so
And
that's in
I'm
this-
asking
Oh, sorry.
if the commissioners need to explain why it's not equitable.
I mean, I would certainly encourage you to ask them that question or make that comment and sort of take into consideration how did you take account for residential uses on the either on the back or the side of the building. I think that's a great comment to make. Right, and so what we're here to do tonight is just to explain sort of how this got here and explain what is the Planning Commission's tentative recommendation. A lot of this is making sure that you all have the information you need to make your comments to the Planning Commission. So we're providing the information we've got, but certainly I don't want to put my sort of words in front of the Planning Commissioners. And certainly, as Jack said, this is a tentative recommendation and they'll make their vote on Wednesday.
Hi, Paul. Erin Flood over here. I think a lot of what people are struggling with are not the goals of middle missing housing or increasing housing, but the relationship between the goals and the specific provisions of this proposal. So like the city keeps saying we want increased housing, and yet there's a lot of by right development being invited onto residential streets. Or we want missing middle housing, and yet it's like apartment and condos that are part of the residential, where multifamily is the higher percentage of all like the housing stock in the city. And then we want things to be more affordable, but we're gonna let luxury townhomes go up at 50 feet on Park Avenue when every townhouse that's sold on Park Avenue in the last 5 years has sold between $1.17 and $1.45 million. So are we really going to get missing middle townhomes, or are we just placing a disproportionate burden on, senior residents who are living at the Broadway to get 6 multi-million-dollar homes on Park Avenue? So like the inconsistencies I think are hard between the specific provisions and the goals because it's just a hodgepodge of everything. And then on top of it, I guess, to the extent you can answer questions about why the proposal does look the way it does, I think a lot of people have questions about Susan Bell, right? Former planning director of Arlington, the city hired expert consultant, said that she would recommend lot coverage at 50% for both building coverage and impervious surface maximums so that there would be increased residential development while also maintaining tree canopy and controlling stormwater. Without an explanation out of council, we get 80% lot coverage for by right commercial development and residential development with no impervious surface maximums. Then the Planning Commission says 60% lot coverage, 80% impervious surface maximums, again with no explanation of where these numbers are coming from. So I think for the general public, it seems like numbers are getting pulled out of thin air and that there's a proposal that is largely like driven by a couple of properties on Park Avenue. So why is there such a discrepancy between what Susan Bell recommended at the beginning of this and where we are 2 years later, only now allowing public input for the first time?
Sure. So let me start with the affordable housing comment, because I think that was the first one. I'll try to sort of take them in order here. Here we go. So one thing to realize is that T-zones are not going to solve the affordable housing problem in the city. They can be part of the affordable housing solution. When you think about T-zones today, right, you're starting from no requirement for affordability. Sure. So Sure, so I can skip this one, and I guess I will say that just sort of some of the other pieces, I do want to give credit, to the community, to the council for going out and finding resources for affordable housing, partnering with Amazon to bring more money into the city, to extend the control period for rent-controlled units, buying the units in Virginia Village to preserve those in perpetuity, working with other market rate housing units within the city to see if they can't sort of be brought into a control mechanism to guarantee that in perpetuity. So it is exciting to see the work that's going on in the community to preserve affordable housing. So I don't want to sort of sell those efforts short. In terms of the changes over time, maybe the place to go is in lot coverages, because I think that was one of the specific ones you mentioned, sort of why is the lot coverage seemingly sort of jumping from a low number to a high number, then to something in the middle, and what are all these based on? I think a lot of these are based on looking at, certainly with the setbacks, we went through and we did a code analysis looking at other jurisdictions and tried to narrow it down and figure out what seems reasonable. A lot of this was coming out of course, we've been over time building a library of example projects from around the region, right? We know some that are too big, we know some that are maybe a more appropriate size, and so a lot of these numbers are driven by looking at those pictures and saying, well, no, I don't want that building. And so you're hearing the opinions and the recommendations of the various council members and planning commissioners play out in these tables. And I think they're looking at those example projects and saying, that one's too big, that one's too small. What would the lot coverage need to be for that? And so that's how this works, is something gets sort of thrown up on the board, people think about what that means, they look at some other example projects, and you can see these numbers shift, right? Tree canopy going up, lot coverage impervious coverage coming down, building coverage sort of meandering its way into a middle ground. But I think that's just part of the dialogue and thinking about what that would be and trying to settle on something that would be the right fit for the T-zones.
I'll ask the affordable housing question. So you just said this isn't going to solve affordable housing, but it is in the first paragraph of every single thing the city puts out there. It was the first two slides you had to talk about here. But at the same time, your uses are pulling out residential, putting in commercial. I'm not an expert. My understanding is the 10% is probably characteristic of what we've seen in every development that's gone up lately. And in fact, if you choose not to build any housing at all, then there is no affordable housing. There's a very real possibility these changes might allow no housing at all. There would be no affordable housing. I don't really see this as advancing affordable housing at all, especially when you're talking about 3% of the city. It's not even a part of a solution. It's not a solution at all. Why do we keep seeing this as the very first thing you guys call out? Because this seems to do, can you tell me how this helps affordable housing in any real substantive way as it would have before this proposal was put forward? I think we still have the same leverage, the same 10%, the same more residential uses. I don't see this helping housing at all.
So I think the question was sort of, how is this a part of the solution? Is that a fair way to phrase the question?
Let's make it harder on you. This doesn't look like a housing solution at all. Tell me that it could possibly be one.
Sure. So two of the example projects we actually, So two of the example projects, and we don't have our sort of library of materials with us, but two of the projects we actually that actually got us started thinking about how to make it easier to develop in the T-zones, but easier to develop smaller buildings, were actually two proposals that couldn't make it through the special exception process. So if folks remember a few years ago, there was a proposal at, Park and Lee, where there was a proposal for sort of high quality condos and then some sort of commercial uses on the ground floor. But in order to fit in the form of a special exception approval, it needed to provide so much commercial space, so much affordable housing, and other voluntary concessions like school capital costs. And by the time the thing actually was sort of large enough to pay for all those community benefits, the building was so large that it couldn't get through the approval process. Similarly, there was a project proposal at Broad and Spring where a custom home builder, Tradition Homes, wanted to set up their own office space, have a permanent home inside the city, and they were going to finance the project with condos above to pay for the development. But again, in order to pay for all of the community benefits that are customary with a special exception, they actually couldn't make their way through the special exception process. And so what this motivated was there needs to be an approach. The special exception process works for 2-acre, 2.5, 3-acre projects. But if you've got 1 acre to develop, you can't afford to make your way through. Part of it is the timeline and the depth of review, but also part of it is the expectation that's placed on these special exception projects. So can we knock out some of the typical requirements and find something that can fit in a smaller scale and provide some affordable housing?
Talked about the process, but where's the housing? There is.
Well, today, right, because today what gets built in T-zones is one house at a time. And so if you're only building one, $1.8 million house at a time, you're never going to provide affordable housing. So the townhouse, if we go up to this may actually help unpack some of the mystery here. So if we go back to the uses slide. So it's true that you can develop townhouses by right in T-zones today, but only if you acquire 3 acres of T-zone land. There is no place left in the city where you can acquire 3 acres of T-zone land that's contiguous. So yes, it's an allowable use, but it's not actually reachable. And so what the council recognized is that instead of having this sort of prohibition, effectively a prohibition against townhouses, well, let's allow townhouses, but on a smaller scale, and take them through a community sort of review process like the special use permit process, where we consider the specific design elements of each site as it comes through. And so this is the proposal. Yes, T-zones is allowed, but effectively you can't do it because of the lot size requirements. What's proposed by council and supported by Planning Commission is finding a way to actually make townhouses possible.
Thank you. I'm going to ask, all of my questions are going to be related to the commercial retail use. So I'll just kind of break it up so it makes it easier for you to answer, which is slide 9 up there. Thank you. How is the middle column, the additional retail business and service establishments, determined? How is that list come up with? These are supposed to be kind of straightforward questions, most of them.
Sure. No, this was, so this list looks a lot like what's in the B1, which is the general sort of business zoning district, but it's pared down to try to focus on those uses that you would typically see in your neighborhood shops or your corner shops. So things like smaller bakeries, shoe repair shop, barber shop, clothing stores, sort of the smaller things that you might see as an everyday need or an everyday use.
Okay, and has there been any economic analysis to go with this list that just appeared in the council's proposal? Has there been any actual study of, are these the right things?
Well, no, I don't think it was an economic analysis. So I think it was just looking at sort of what do other places typically have in sort of their main streets or their transitional streets, and what could then the city include in it.
And now, having followed this closely, besides one person on the Planning Commission on January 25th mentioning she thought parking lots should be deleted, which I see is in your 3rd column, has anyone in the council or the Planning Commission actually discussed what's on that list? I mean, I've missed it in any public meeting. Has it been discussed by anybody at this point?
I think the Planning Commission did ask some questions about sort of how did this list come to be, very similar to your question. And then there was some conversation sort of late at the Planning Commission's last work session about whether some of these uses shouldn't be either removed from the list or whether some of them shouldn't require a special use permit. And certainly as this goes back to council and obviously with the expectation of a council re-referral, again, that would be something worth exploring.
Okay, and when I first saw the council's proposal, I thought it was rather strange that all the commercial uses could be built by right up to the size of 80% and 50 feet tall, et cetera. But if a similarly structured was built for use for housing, the building would have to be subject to the special use process. Why is the standard harder to get housing approved than for commercial property?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's probably staff's fault. I think probably the thinking was that a lot of these things were probably going to occupy the ground floor of a space, right? It's sort of Well, I suppose that Heidelberg is a two-story bakery. But I think it's sort of rare to see some of these things take up more than 2 floors. And so the thinking was that these uses probably aren't going to motivate sort of commercial structures of that size. But certainly it would be worth considering, should we, sort of cap the height of those commercial buildings.
And as an expert planner in living and knowing Falls Church City back and forth, so this is a setup. Do you
I
think
feel it coming.
Do you think it makes sense to have retail space along Park Avenue between Lee Street and Founders Row when lease space can't be filled a block away on Broad Street? Everyone talks about we want to be able to walk.
So it's true there are some commercial vacancies around the city. For
Like in our building.
So if you actually look at all the square footage that's available in the city for those retail spaces, the city has an unusually low vacancy rate. So the city's typically 90+% occupied for its retail spaces, and that compares very favorably to the rest of the region, where it's 70%, maybe 80%. So the city's actually been very lucky in the recent history about being able to fill those retail spaces. I agree, there are some eyesores that remain vacant over time.
But it's interesting, I thought the city council a year or so eliminated the requirement for multi-use buildings, not having multi-use anymore, that there had to be commercial space on the first floor because people were having trouble filling it. So I missed that change, I misunderstood that change.
A couple of years ago, there was a change to the special exception ordinance. That might be what you're asking about. So there was a change. It was a mechanical change in the ordinance. The old ordinance read that there needed to be a net square footage increase in the commercial space, and the new language reads that there needs to be a significant new commercial space. And so the idea behind pushing for a significant space is something that's either sort of meaningful to the nearby neighborhood, or meaning on a sort of a citywide or a region-wide scale, versus holding up maybe an arbitrary number. If you think about an old building that hasn't been occupied for a very long time, you're sort of establishing sort of an unfair or sort of a different bar anyway from maybe the property just next door.
Okay. And I should say I live in the Broadway, so I'm particularly looking at Park Avenue. Between Pennsylvania Avenue and Lee Street, if consolidated, that area behind, along that area in that one block is 1 2/3 acres. And I can't be suspicious that a developer isn't trying right now to consolidate that area. So let me just pose a hypothetical to you. A permissible use is inns, not defined anywhere I could find. So could a Comfort Inn be built on Park Street along there the way this is written by right?
It's a good question. I could look up the definition, although if you've searched the zoning ordinance and didn't find it, that's we could probably look elsewhere for one. But yeah, that's a good question. If someone wanted to put in a new hotel by right, I don't know that that's necessarily the footprint for a Comfort Inn, but we could certainly look at it.
Okay, well, I'm just saying inns leave it pretty broadly open, and I think you haven't looked at some of the unintended consequences when you talk about everyone's looking at pieces of that block, but not looking at 1 2/3 acres, which you could end up with a very different building allowed by right, which I don't think is anticipated. I'm coming to almost my end. One of my favorite questions you've gotten from me more than once is a continuing by right permissibility is professional offices, including medical and dental, as well as hospitals for human care. Not that I expect the hospital to be built in a T-zone with the zoning approval, however. The proposed ordinance specifically asks, you'll see it's the very first thing under add in the middle column, clinics for human care, which I keep saying, what is a clinic for human care if it's not a medical office, it's not a hospital? And so I must admit, I asked a few months ago, and I'm all for this, guys, but there's an abortion clinic on Lee Highway in a transitional zone building on South Washington, and it's a permissible activity. So I'm wondering, why was this specifically added? Is that to make sure that any T-zone can continue to have abortion clinics, which might not be popular in certain areas across the street where the protesters are, but I do need to keep asking that question. Why is that added? Because we all should be suspicious because someone wanted these things in here for some reason. And I can't get an answer. Is there an answer now?
So I can't answer the definition of a clinic for human care. It is generally an outpatient facility with probably 1 or more doctors.
A medical office in another phrase, okay.
Right. Yep. So it is intended to provide for sort of outpatient sort of surgical services, medical services. As to sort of the genesis of how this got in here, I can't speak to that, but I can provide a definition of what it is.
Okay, so my closing question, if it's good enough for clinics for human care, one would have to ask, why can't there be clinics for animal care? Because that's how arbitrary the list is, guys. If you go through it, you can have an antique store, but you can't have a gift store. You can, if you look at, compare why they were crossed out, the whole thing doesn't really make sense. So that's why I bring it up. So I'm gonna let someone else have it, but that's just the retail side of things.
Hi, Paul. Gene Gresco on North Fairfax Street. And again, thanks for this presentation. Just question in terms of back to the issue of, let's call it diverse housing, okay? Has the Planning Commission considered limiting the size of housing that could be built to, again, it won't necessarily, it'll be diverse in terms of people can afford the houses if they're smaller, namely saying, pick a number, condos at 1,500 square feet max, or townhouses at 2,500 square feet max, thus preventing like 4-story townhouses at the 1.5 or whatever the number was listed here. That way you could at least capture a little bit of a diverse market that wouldn't by just opening it up, that obviously a developer will just say, I'm gonna maximize, but if you limit the size, that's one way to limit it. Also, have the Planning Commission considered how to incentivize those developers, if this goes through, to provide a condo that a person could buy and start obtaining equity and building equity that young people, our grandchildren and children want to do to start, just like we have, start building equity. How have you considered ways to incentivize condos as opposed to rental units, which, as you can look at all these mixed use around here, they're all rentals. I think we have enough rentals. We need more folks that can buy a condo, 2-bedroom, start a family, and that way, again, diversity of housing that, more a moderate income folks could go and start in and then go from there.
Yeah, they're both good questions. So I think the first one was about sort of the size of the units. And you can actually see this in zoning jurisdictions in other places. They actually set minimum sizes on units, minimum lot sizes, minimum square footages for buildings, minimum floor plates. Obviously, city uses that as well for single-family housing zoning. And the RTH zone actually establishes a minimum size floor plate for each townhouse. And the motivation for that is actually to drive up the price because it's more expensive to own more land, to build bigger houses. And so I think your idea is a good one. Come at it from the other side. If we're trying to promote, if the goal is to promote affordability and diversity, then set a cap on unit sizes. And I think that's certainly worth exploring. The second question was about rental versus condo. So there's nothing, you can't be explicit in your zoning ordinance about the form of the ownership. You can't dictate how a piece of property is owned or used. How it's used, but you can't dictate ownership and occupancy. But you can sort of motivate it by the form. So these larger buildings that are going in with 100, 200, 300 units, it's very hard to build a 200 plus unit condo building. It's very risky for a builder who's got to sell these things, a few at a time to try and carry the cost of all that construction for that many years. It's also very efficient to manage 200, 300 apartments at a time with a couple of property managers. So the form of these buildings that are going up recently is very conducive to apartments. On the flip side, if you could motivate, say, a development of an acre or less, that would be much more conducive to an ownership structure because no one wants to manage a handful of apartments at a time. It's very cumbersome, it's very expensive. How do you get your property manager on site? So I think just the structure of this being targeted at smaller sites, I think would be sort of an inducement to ownership options.
Hi, Paul. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
Bill Schmidl, off of Pennsylvania Avenue.
It's been a while.
Yeah. Two quick questions. The first, what time frame are we looking at if everything is adopted in a smooth fashion? Number one. And number two, what consideration have you made to class sizes, the effects on schools with bringing in a lot more people? Because it seems that we've just built up the schools, but still the class sizes are pretty maxed out right now. My kids are in class sizes of 30 and so. So what type of effect will all this have on the schools?
Sure. So let's go back. Let's see. First question. So there was a question about class sizes, and then the first question was about timeline, I think, in terms of what this could look like. So this, and I know it's hard to see from your angle, but over here is when the council first got going before, and I'm sorry to put my back to you, Jack. Before council made their first referral, they spent, and I don't know that it would take them this many work sessions again, but they did spend 5 work sessions. It might be fewer on the second pass. Planning Commission took 7, 8 work sessions. So a lot of this is variable, but assuming Planning Commission proceeds to a recommendation February 15th, what we're tentatively scheduled to do is take a work session with council in early March, and then set up for a new first reading in late March. And then that would trigger a new round of review with the Planning Commission, which I expect would probably take at least 2 work sessions before their sort of public hearing. So you'd be looking at maybe a first reading end of March, and now I'm spitballing here, but you're looking at sort of April, May, maybe for the Planning Commission, but then you're in budget season, so maybe it drags out a little bit longer before it gets back to council, either before summer or sort of late summer. Oh, a building go up? Well, then you actually have to wait for someone to find the property and consolidate all the financing, and then actually put in a proposal that can be reviewed and approved. So there are no applications in, and so the timeline to an actual building would be speculative. Sure. So the other one, if we go back, and I'm sorry we don't have these numbers. If we go back to one of the Y slides where we talked about local planning. So one of the components, so city's comprehensive plan looks at all these things. It looks at demographics, right? Thinking about population growth. It thinks about transportation needs, housing needs, environmental needs, as well as school facility needs. And updating school facilities, as well as getting an updated set of demographic projections and school population projections is on the short list of things to do in the next few months.
Thank you. I live in the Broadway as well, and I've got an interest in the slide that addressed stormwater. And I think basically what is recommended is that the volume of post-development runoff must not be greater than pre-development. And last year in the Broadways, we spent about $200,000 trying to address an increasing volume of stormwater issues. We even sent pictures to the city of cars on Broad Street with the water up above the tires when we had really bad storms. And we know we're going to get more bad storms because of climate change. We're going to have to deal with that. But I'm wondering how you can apply that single kind of rule across all of these T-zones when you've got one particular area. The city is even looking at from Lincoln down to Broad, stormwater issues. That you could apply a simple rule like that to a place that really needs, we're obliged to fix it now. And if that's the rule, we may never get around to it. So anyway, I happen not to believe that we're going to get a automobile repair shop or a barber shop when anybody builds there, but we are going to continue to have this stormwater issue, and applying a rule all the way across like that is not going to help us to remediate.
Sure, and yes, the Broadway's got a problem with stormwater, and that's a struggle. So this slide up here is trying to summarize the stormwater code as it exists today, and so this is not proposing any changes. These are the stormwater regulations that apply to any development wherever it occurs in the city. So whether it's in a T-zone or a B1 district, it has to meet these requirements. That it improves quality and it doesn't make quantity any worse. Some of the considerations that go into crafting a zoning ordinance is, right, a lot of the zoning ordinance regulations are about limiting the impacts that you have on your neighbors. And so I know the council took the initiative to stand up the Stormwater Task Force, identify the big six, and they really are looking at, let's get a better handle on the quantity, right? It was a wake-up call when there was the big storm and all the bridges were overtopped. Although it probably wasn't a wake-up call to folks that are suffering flooding on a more regular basis. But I think that has motivated a lot of action on stormwater quantity throughout the city. So some of this is a citywide problem. I will say on the larger acre projects, like the Broad in Washington, Founders Row 2, Founders Row 1, because of their larger acreages, they can fit larger size storm vaults into their site infrastructure. So they do, as a matter of course, volunteer a reduction in stormwater quantity, sometimes 10%, sometimes 20%. But whether you could achieve that on a smaller site, I'm just not sure that the size of the site allows for the engineering.
Thank you. I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that I've only heard the words tree canopy mentioned in passing. And I think that it's very important when you talk about transition zones that you think it is a transition and that tree canopy is extremely important for whether it's a large building that the T-zone backs up to or it's someone's house that it backs up to. So I think that that's something that needs to be given a little bit more attention than it's been given so far. And I would hope that as planners you would encourage the attention to that.
Oh, Jack's already jumped to it. I agree. I like trees. I don't. It's hard to find someone who doesn't like trees. But so there is, right, as stipulated today, there is no requirement for tree canopy in the T-zones. And that's something that certainly the Planning Commission acknowledged and wanted to try to write. The motivation for this 15% number is that it is the maximum allowable tree canopy that the city can require. So State of Virginia establishes that on different kinds of development, localities can require certain tree canopies. And for the proposed densities here, the maximum that could be required is 15%. And so the Planning Commission said, well, let's go ahead and require the maximum.
Thank you. Tim Rund from Spring Street. Pretty amazing conversation going on tonight. I mean, it's really good stuff. Jack, you said something, I have a real quick question and then a comment. You said something about a $1 million fee to do some of the planning for the SUP and the special exemption. I'm just kind of curious, where did that number come from?
So if you go back to that number, so this was in conversation, and I want to be clear about this, that obviously Susan Bell was doing research by talking to developers that were active in the region, but none that were actively pursuing a place in the city. And then similarly, we've been talking to developers that do townhouse style development, but not at the acreages we're talking about. And so that is one thing I wanted to ask them, as well as folks who have applied for special exceptions recently in the city. I've asked them sort of what is the cost to go through this process. So to get through a special exception process, obviously it's months of staff time on their part. So it's paying for engineers, architects, lawyers, right? And the attorney charges the same fee, whether they're defending a 1 acre case or a 4 acre case. And so a lot of these costs are largely fixed in terms of the hours of work you're paying for. And so that's what that $1 million is. It's the summation of all those soft costs and all the specialties.
The reason I asked that question is that you worked with us. I was part of the Spring Street and Broad project. You were amazing. But I have to tell you, that $1 million fee to try to reduce the amount of process The only thing that saved us was the process and Mr. Stoddard, because the developer wanted to jam in a development that was going to bring maybe 250 cars on Spring Street into a development. Anybody who's ever done Spring Street, there's no way in the morning or evening. And I'm telling you that because they did their traffic study in July when there was nobody there. They hired a kid to sit out there and count cars. And if this process had been reduced, we would have never caught it. So quite frankly, Paul, I'm happy with the process taking a bit of time and that there being some reviews. I guess I didn't care if it cost the guy $1 million. He claimed that he pulled out because of the money. I think we all knew that it wasn't a good development. So anyway, this is a great group. I love this city. There's a lot of good conversation. But I can't thank you enough for being actively involved with us, meeting with us, and all of that. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Mom. I'm on Pennsylvania Avenue, and I have two comments. One, on public notice. I'm sure you've met the minimum requirements for public notice for the council meetings and the planning commission meetings, but really, I think a lot of people in my particular neighborhood, the affected by the Park Street proposal, really only know about this through the tireless efforts of our neighbors. I would never have known about this without that. So I guess I have a request to the Planning Commission and to the City Council to be a lot more proactive in engaging people, because this is a small community. I really think you could do so much better in educating the population that's going to be affected by these proposals. And so I'll stop on that one. And then the second thing is differential treatment. There's 3 T-zones, and I don't have a depth of knowledge on this. I haven't had a lot of time, but it seems to me that the one on Park is a very different neighborhood than the one on Washington, and that there should not be one proposal that affects all 3.
Thank you. I'm Marty Meserve. I live on Berry Street. I think the questions tonight have shown us just how much confusion exists around this proposal, and I'm wondering why the rush. I think that the examples you mentioned about the 2 developments that were stymied in the T-zone because the restrictions were too great, well, I think that the solution that's been proposed goes well beyond the problems that you described. I think that as others have said, this proposal is just filled with potholes of unintended consequences in trying to have one size fit all of these 50-plus parcels in the city. I've spoken to people who have problems on both sides of this proposal. Some who say it's not dense enough, others who say it's too dense. I think that is the clearest indication that this proposal needs to go back to the drawing board. We need to start again from our goals. We need to take a closer look at how affordable and middle housing is going to be stimulated in the city. And I would like to see, and I don't want you to go into it now, but I'd like to take a look at each one of these affected parcels. I would like to understand which ones are most likely to be redeveloped. I would like to know how these proposals will change what can be done on those most likely to be redeveloped lots from what they can do now. And I would like to see how those most likely to be redeveloped lots would advance the purported goals that the council has laid forward that this ordinance is supposed to address. Thank you.
I'm Jane Singleton. I live on East Columbia Street. So if I understand all of this, which I will admit I don't really very well, my land and house would never be affected. So I'm encouraged by the last two people who asked a question because I feel like I'm not even at T-Zone 101. I'm like at T-Zone 50. Have these zones always existed?
Yes, I think at least going back as far as the 60s when the city first established its zoning ordinance.
Okay,
50s.
so all of these that we're talking about now have existed in these zones. I mean, not exactly as they are now, but these zones themselves have always been there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the basics of the city zoning ordinance have been stable over time.
And if this goes through in whatever form, modified as is now, whatever, it's not as if suddenly there's going to be a ton of redevelopment coming in. Each lot within the zone has to be treated one by one. Is that correct?
Yeah, each property has to be developed. If we can go to the process slide, this was the busy one, and it always makes me nervous even when I look at it. Just the volume of information. So let me start here. So this is the site plan process, and as Jack said, a site plan is required for any development that includes more than 50 square feet of building space. So it's just about anything bigger than a closet requires a site plan.
Is that citywide? Or are you
Yes,
talking about these-
citywide.
Okay.
Actually, single-family housing is exempt from this. It goes through the grading plan process, but otherwise, all development in the city goes through the site plan process. And we laid out sort of a tentative timeline. If the applicant hits it just right and they meet all the regulations and it's only a few technical cleanups, it might be as fast as 3 months. But typically, starting from this point, a site plan is typically somewhere in that 4 to 6 month range. And all of that includes, obviously, technical review to make sure it meets the development regulations. The building isn't too big, doesn't take up too much space, it's going to have the required trees, it's not going to flood the neighbor's property. All those things get reviewed by staff. It also gets reviewed publicly by the Planning Commission, the Architectural Advisory Board, Urban Forestry Commission, and all of that happens in advertised meetings. Site plans also trigger advertising requirements. In terms of the notices that are put out for the public meetings, as well as letters to the adjoining property owners. So the site plan process applies to everything. The layer on the left is additional review that happens even before that. So the special exception process, we put this up here just because that's what folks are probably used to for the major redevelopments. And this timeline of 11 months is just about the fastest it could mechanically go, but recent SE approvals have taken 18 months, 24 months. So this is not a fast process. The SUP process is put up here for comparison. It still has a significant level of public review with workshops at various boards and commissions, final to approval, and of course, again, even after the special use permit process, it would still proceed to site plan. So each of these would take their own time, get their own consideration, and make consideration for not only the specific property, but what's around them.
So if nothing happens at all, if someone who currently occupies a lot doesn't want to make a change, is that correct?
They don't have to. Yeah, no one.
Nobody can come
unless
up and say,
Yeah.
I want to do this T-zone thing on your lot.
No, you can't. If we go back to the map.
And thank you all for listening to my questions and understanding. I just didn't understand, so sorry to waste your
No,
time.
I like these. I didn't know these things either until I went to planning school. So, so these regulations only apply to a piece of property so every piece of land in the city carries a zoning designation, whether it's T zone, B zone, R zone. B zone is the business districts, T is these transitionals, and R's are the residential where you have single family housing. You can only develop under these regulations if your property carries that zoning designation. So these are only applicable to these purple and blue properties that are sort of scattered about the map.
I will admit, I have figured that much
Okay, that's fine. I just want to make sure everyone's starting from the same plane here. And then, so the only way you would even develop under these regulations is if you had a willing property owner and a willing developer. That they have to make an agreement that they want to do this, they have to put in their application, and they have to get an approval. So it's not as if these things, sort of the city code makes things possible, but it doesn't require them. So you could have an allowance to build a townhouse unit, but if the property owner doesn't want to build townhouses, then they don't have to build townhouses.
Okay, I think I get that.
Okay.
I mean, it just, The whole thing sounds like disaster could be coming our way, which I realize is an exaggeration. But I'm not going to say whether I'm for it or not. I don't feel educated enough yet. Property owner A gets an offer to be bought out to do something in the purple or the blue zone. Property owner can say yes or no, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah,
All
they
right,
don't have
thank
to
you
say
very
yes.
much.
Yeah, and there are a lot of properties on this map that have reasons to stay where they are that oftentimes property ownership is a funny thing. A lot of people who own commercial properties, if they've got solid tenants and they're collecting rent checks, then it's usually not worth it to them to sell the property. If they're collecting money and making good rent, then they'll just keep it until something breaks.
My name is Barry DiMaio, and I live at the Broadway. The Broadway condominium building includes several ground floor commercial tenants close to or along Broad Street, but is principally a residential building, and it has 80 residences. Any commercial development in the T-zone properties immediately north of the Broadway would be incompatible with the 36 Broadway residences facing those T-zone properties, and the homes on the other side of Park Avenue between Lee and Pennsylvania Avenue as well. My question is, can the rezoning proposal be redrafted to motivate developers to build townhouses or sixplexes north of the Broadway, housing that would be harmonious with existing neighbors?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair question about when you have there aren't a lot of allowances in the city code made for sort of multi-family buildings like the Broadway. So a lot of the restrictions or the buffer requirements or the spacing requirements are all based on, are you next to a single family zoned district, or are you next to a townhouse district, but not, are you next to a B district with a special exception on it. I have been looking for regional examples of how folks handle that, and I think it's something that could probably use some more research.
So it's almost like the Broadway itself is a It's like the Broadway itself is a transitional zoned property. That's what it feels like. So what we're looking at then is north of Broadway, which is overlooking Park Avenue, and the Broadway itself looking on the other side of the currently transition zoned property. And it's almost like it ought to be residential, not commercial whatsoever. We are the mixed use property at the Broadway. Again, we're principally residential with some commercial. So it would seem that the property in between the other side of Park Avenue and the Broadway ought to be residential, period.
Yeah, I definitely hear the point, and I think it's a good one to put to the Planning Commission and see what they can make of it.
So when do you do that?
Well, so they are meeting for their public hearing next Wednesday, and I would encourage everyone who's, if you had questions that I couldn't answer, you had points you wanted to make to the Planning Commission, see if you want to see changes in the proposal, then making those comments to the Planning Commission is the right thing to do.
You can't do that. You can't recommend to them from tonight's meeting?
So we've got a recommendation posted, so you can see that online. We post the Planning Commission packet a week in advance, and it's pretty rare for us to make changes to the packet sort of between posting and the meeting.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
So the first one is, you had spoke about parking, off-street parking. You said one space per home.
Mm-hmm.
What if this is commercial? So how many off-street parking spaces are required for a commercial?
So they would still be set, so there's no proposed changes to the commercial parking regulations. And if you thought the other tables were daunting. So commercial parking regulations, they establish the number of spaces you have, and it can vary based on the use. So it might be based on square footage or the number of tables. If it's a restaurant, for example, office use requires one space for every 450 square feet of building space. Restaurants is more than that. Movie theaters is based on the number of, although I don't think anyone's putting a movie theater in a T-zone. But, bowling alleys require so many lanes. So that's all in there.
Okay.
And those are in the code today, and there aren't any proposed changes from those.
Okay, and my other question is, has there been any kind of a traffic study related to these T-zones? If you are putting in a condo on Park Avenue, which is already busy, Broad Street, I don't think can take much more traffic, especially at rush hour. We've got the new units that are going up, on Broad and West. We've got the construction that's going on down at Washington and Broad. How much more traffic is Park and Broad Street going to be able to handle if we start putting in, these larger and commercial properties there?
Right. So larger projects, sort of the SE sort of scale projects, multi-acres, those always come with a requirement for a traffic impact analysis. They're usually pretty thick documents, and they try to look at sort of projected travel demand. It's a funny thing about the methodology. So the way the industry developed in transportation engineering, they tried to get a handle on sort of how many trips come out of a McDonald's, out of an office building, out of an apartment building. And they're like, well, how are we going to count these things? Well, we'll go to some place where there's nothing else around. And that way we know that all the trips going in and out of that McDonald's were just for that McDonald's. And so they went out and counted all these trips in these places where there was nothing else around. So the only way to get there was by a car. And then they said, well, this must be the rate. And then they generally apply. Now, there are modification factors, but they apply those basically even in urban areas like Falls Church, where it has a very high walk score, meaning you can walk to a lot of different things. I think half the population is within a 10-minute walk of Harris Teeter. So when the Northgate, one of the early mixed-use buildings in the city, went in, they did their traffic projections, and then afterwards they had to do a post-occupancy study and say, well, does the traffic actually look like what you thought it was? Even though the building was fully occupied, residential and commercial, the actual trip counts were 42% lower than what had been projected. It's just, people just don't use their cars as much as those models say they do. And then another way to look at it citywide, there was recently a commentary, it's probably a couple months old now, but one of the planning commissioners, whose day job is transportation policy, looked at historical traffic data in the city. He picked years, I think he went from 2005-ish to 2018. He wanted to stop, obviously, short of the pandemic data, which throws everything off. But what he found in that period, when there was heavy development in the city, multifamily housing coming to the city, what he found was that the total number of car trips was actually declining in the city. I know it can be hard to believe, because when most folks are out on the street is when most other folks are out on the street, so they see traffic. But if you go out on city streets at those off times, they're usually pretty empty. You still have to plan for the crunch times. But what's happening is that as development is happening and more things are within walking distance, and the city is not an attractive cut-through, or at least is not as much as it used to be, that regional traffic is finding another way to get around, and folks in the city are also finding other ways to get around. So yes, there are more people, but that doesn't always mean there are more cars.
Hi, I just want to go back to the question that the gentleman before asked about the schools and the impact to the city. So I live on Park Avenue, and I've sat on commissions before, and I've had a lot of conversations with councils over the years. And what I found was the lessons of the Whittier site are always forgotten or put to the side. 50 townhouses, not going to be any kids, maybe 17 kids total. Within a couple of years, there were 2 busloads of kids. Weren't going to be that many cars because everything's walkable. There's over 100 cars from that 50 townhouse. So what are we doing to look at the infrastructure to really make sure it's supported?
Sure. The question about school capacity is obviously an important one in the city, right? There's one high school, there's one middle school, and so there is a concern about, is there enough capacity, right? It's not like you can redistrict. And so that is something that always gets an attentive eye on the bigger projects. And like I said, there is a commitment on the city staff side to update its demographic projections and update its school enrollment projections as well.
Close to what the studies say, because I have seen the city councils pick and choose which studies they pay attention to suit the needs at the moment. Also, just a quick question, if you're not shy about this, is there anyone in this room who's for this proposal as is?
I don't think this group is really representative of that, because young people, working people, those suffering most from affordable housing don't have time on a Thursday night to come out here. Working class people can no longer afford to even live in Falls Church.
That's speculative.
But that's, I'm not going to get to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Laura Gogol from Pine Street, and I had a couple of questions. I apologize if some of these are things you've already addressed. But I guess one of the thoughts I had, just in response to the neighbor over there who was asking about whether you could be forced to have your land used as a T-zone if you didn't want to, and obviously the individual landowner on that lot can't be forced to do something, but their neighbor next door to them may well choose to build, to go for this, this approach and sell their land to a developer and get that money to do that. And is it 4 stories? How tall is the structure that's going to be allowed next to my single-story home, or my single-family home?
So today, what's allowable in T-zones by right, and it varies based on the use. But if it's a single-family house, it's 35 feet to the midline. New single-family home construction, often the peak of the roof is higher than 35 feet, but the midline of the roof is 35. Townhouses, 35 feet, and then commercial buildings can be 45 feet. What's proposed by council is a maximum building height of 50 feet, so it's 5 feet taller, but that's with an additional step back on the uppermost floor of another 10 feet. So the height right along the street edge would be 40 feet, and then that extra 10 feet would happen 10 feet further back.
So the people that choose not, choose not to develop their lot that way will potentially have a 50-foot building next to them.
Yeah. Now you mentioned
10 feet away. Okay.
Can we go back to the T-zone map? Well, yeah. So just to be clear, you mentioned Pine Street, which I think is over behind the giant shopping center.
Well, it's within view of Founders Row, and which is now a very visible new development on our skyline.
The reason I bring up this map is I don't think there's anything actually Zone T near Pine Street.
I understand that, but I'm concerned about the whole city. I mean, this is where I've been living for 30 years, and I love it the way it is. So.
Okay. I just wanted to sort of.
But I have other questions.
Oh, sure.
So that's the one question, just to make sure people understand that just because you can't be forced to have your lot changed, your neighbor may very well and likely would have the financial incentive to change their lot. The other question I had is, you mentioned about the tree canopy, and you said that for proposed densities, 15% is the maximum allowed. Do we have to go with the proposed densities, or could we consider different densities and that would allow a greater tree canopy?
The next step down in density, so you can require, I think, a 20% tree canopy on things zoned. It's residential development only, and it's only on residential development. I'd have to look up the numbers, but it's somewhere in that range of like 4 to 8 units an acre.
So that might be one solution, would be to change the proposal to allow something that would allow a more mandatory higher percentage tree canopy. The other question I had was about tax rates and assessments. So it's going back to the individual who chooses not to develop their lot and keep it as a single family home. How is their lot value then appraised? Are they going to be, is the value of their lot what they could sell it to a developer for? Are we going to be taxed for not on the rate that we could have gotten from a developer? Or what will the rate of that property be assessed at?
So it's a question for the assessor, but I think typically in Virginia, you're not taxed on the potential of the property, you're taxed on the current use of the property.
Great.
Sure. Sure.
The
Right, the
last-
reason I say potential, right, is, you know, you think about like a B2 district where you can put a 75-foot tall building on it by right. It's not taxed as a 75-foot tall building. It's the land is taxed to some extent on potential, but then the building is taxed on the current building.
The last question I have is, I guess, are there any safeguards to prevent a developer from purchasing multiple lots in the T-zone and then trying to build a bigger project than just what would fit on one of the T-zone lots? I may have missed that, and I wasn't here for the whole presentation.
There is, so one of the restrictions on development of multifamily housing townhouses is that it could only occur on an acre of an acre or less in size.
Thank you.
But the commercial buildings don't have that acreage limit.
Hello, I'm Don DiLoretto. I was educated in Falls Church, grew up here. I brought my mother tonight and promised not to embarrass her with my question. I appreciate that the city's embraced diversity within these zoning changes. On the surface, I hear what the gentleman said about housing for young families and working class, but the one aspect of diversity I have not heard about tonight is the impact on available senior housing. So could you comment on the level of available senior housing in the form of independent living, assisted living, skilled nursing, memory care, and how, as well as available market rate senior housing and affordable senior housing, and how these zoning changes may impact the level of senior housing?
Yes, obviously you want to provide housing for every group that's out there, right? Everybody needs housing. It's where we all like to go home at night. In terms of senior housing, it wouldn't be. I guess I'm struggling a little bit to formulate an answer, right? Because this is proposed for the T-zone, so what would come down are some of these, these smaller, maybe they're being used as a small professional office today. So it's not, or where housing is being removed, it's one-family housing. So it's not going out and taking down senior housing. So I'm not sure that there's sort of a loss of senior housing, but to your point, there's no specific proposal to include senior housing. And that's certainly something that could be promoted. So as I've said a couple times, if that's something that, and I think it's worthwhile, and so I would encourage you to make your comments to the Planning Commission next Wednesday and say, hey, something you guys ought to consider when you talk to council is make sure there's a way to get some senior housing in here as well.
Hi, I have a question regarding the lot sizes of the T-zones. Could you flip to the T-zone map, please? So do you know which of those lots are the 1 acre versus more than 1 acre?
Oh man, I'm going to flip this one to
Offhand.
Jack. So Jack has been carrying around, and for readability, we took the numbers off the map. Jack, I don't know if you have them in your memory, but I think, Jack, you had sort of summed up acreages of the various sort of collections of T-zones. I don't know if you remember those sort of offhand. It's putting you on the spot, I know.
So the question is which T-zone areas are 1 acre versus more than 1 acre, since that seems to be the differential between residential encouraged versus commercial encouraged, with the 1 acre being the residential encouraged, if I'm...
Yeah, I'll try my best to remember. So I know 900 South Washington is 1 acre itself. This is like not 1 acre. Okay. So yeah, I think the way we had measured it before were assemblages, and so the majority, right? I mean, these here are several acres. This was approaching 1 acre, but wasn't quite 1 acre. Again, this building, 900 South Washington, was 1 acre. I I think this assemblage here was close to an acre. And this might be this is just over 1 acre, but I think 1 2/3 acre, thank you. And then I think, around here could be approaching 1 acre as well. But yeah, sorry, we don't have those labels. I think in the Planning Commission packet materials, that includes that map with the labels.
So those on Park are likely to be commercial, and those on Washington could be commercial, or with the special exemptions could be developed as residential currently. So then if they were to come in and develop those on Washington as residential, do you foresee those being similar to those at Madera Founders Row, or a different type of residential development?
So on Washington, what's in the Planning Commission packet is that this sort of townhouse and condo would be available in T-zone south of Great Falls. These buildings are largely sort of the professional condos that are sort of tucked in with the various driveways and parking lots. And so I think that would remain sort of a smaller scale, right? The building height of 40 feet, 50 feet is only going to allow for so much development. And if those condo offices are all occupied, it's not likely that they would develop soon. What's in the proposal for north of Washington is actually to not allow multifamily via the T-zone, and that's based on the small area plan guidance, which envisions North Washington as being a commercial corridor. And so the principle is that in order to ensure commercial development, that leaving it in the existing T-zone where it allows commercial by right but not residential, and if they did want to pursue residential, then another process would be more appropriate. And then Park Avenue, correct? It could be sort of those smaller commercial uses today based on the lot sizes, or a few of these could potentially consolidate and make up townhouses or a small condo building.
So they could consolidate and make one larger building similar to that size of Madera Founders Row, or other existing
Oh
larger
gosh, no,
buildings
I'm
in the
sorry,
area?
Founders Row too, I'm sorry, now I understand the question. So Founders Row is 4.3 acres in size.
Okay.
So realize that Founders Row is bigger than 4 of these projects.
So I'm just trying to understand where this housing affordability comes in. As a young professional that has come up, a 26-year-old, as a sort of entry level in the job market, a planner by profession, myself working in the affordable housing program in Montgomery County, we've seen a lot of developers come in and just meet that minimum requirement for affordable housing. And where there's no requirement here, I don't really see where that's going to come in, and requiring them to give money to a fund when there's no process set up to spend that fund on affordable housing elsewhere in the city where honestly might be isolated and not in these main development zones. I don't really see how you can start the presentation with the first slide going to affordable housing and diversity and inclusion when that doesn't really seem to be the case. I've lived in places like Richmond where that housing affordability comes from the redevelopment of townhouses where you have, $700, $1,000 rents, which is half of what we're seeing of the studio apartments in the city now, go up because of redevelopment of smaller townhomes, even single family homes. So when these larger lot buildings come in, and even if they provide 10% affordability, you have units where you have to be making over $80,000 a year to afford a studio apartment. It just doesn't really hit that inclusivity that you've been talking about. While I would love to see further commercial use throughout the city, I think it would draw a lot of people in. And what makes the city different than that around is that kind of historic, welcoming, walkable, really pedestrian-focused feel without any real design. Although you have the setbacks and stuff, there's different things like in Loudoun County, they have design requirements that different developers have to sort of hit. I haven't seen any of that says, it has to meet the character of the city, it has to match the buildings around it, it all has to flow. There are certain steps that you could take as a planner in these zoning regulations that I just haven't seen. So I think without hitting that, affordable housing and missing middle within the zoning, it's hard to see it come in and hit that as the first slide when it doesn't actually hit in the zoning text, and then to say, it's for the city to draw people in and increase revenue and spending, but then it's not actually going to match the character of the city. I don't really understand how this zoning can match what the city needs.
Thank you. Thank you for such a comprehensive presentation. I have a simple question about the tree canopies. I noticed there's no requirement in the city council reference, right? And then you put 15%. My question is, what is the real tree canopy coverage now? What's the percentage now?
Sure. So the question is just sort of what's the existing tree canopy in the T-zones? And I don't have that number off.
Okay, we love this city. This lady mentioned about the character of the city. We love the city, we love the green of the city. So it's really important at least to keep it as it is. So that's just my question. At least we tell us what is the existing one, we want to keep it. I don't live near any of the zone area, but everybody, if you ask anybody in the city, we want to keep it as green as possible, maybe even greener, for our generation and for the next generation.
Hi. We purchased a home on the corner of Park Avenue in Virginia and are remodeling and about to move in. And in the past 14 months, there have been 6 auto accidents on Virginia Avenue. Every day you see families walking on Virginia and on Park Avenue. The bus stops are always full. The parking is horrible, it's deplorable. You cannot park in front of your own home. Of course, we've had construction workers there too, which is about to end in a week. But it's awful, and there are tags expired parked out in front of our house. And not just that, the thing we're concerned about is after this big grant goes in with the farmer's market and everything, parking is gonna be a whole lot worse. What kind of feasibility study has been done for parking for all this to ensure safety for our families?
Sure. So I think the question is sort of, well, there were a couple things in there. I just want to make sure I understand sort of the question is sort of, is it sort of more of a concern or a question?
Yes. Is there a feasibility study for parking or added coming in of the people moving in?
Sure. Sure. So if we go to the parking slide, there's, maybe now's not the right time, but I'll say it anyway. I'm on a roll. There's a great quote out there that says, you can never have enough free parking. It's like free parking is like pizza. If we had enough, if we gave out free pizza, we'd never have enough pizza. And if you make all the parking for free, well, of course people are going to use it. And so some of that is what's going on along Park Avenue, where yes, there are limits and there are zones and there are time hours, but you can park there as many times as you want. So people do. One of the things this sort of recognizes also is that sort of the space you build, people will occupy it, right? So when you look at townhouses require 2.5 spaces per unit, then people are gonna, people who want multiple cars are gonna pick townhouses in the city because there's lots of parking spaces for them. So they're gonna bring all their cars with them. But it is possible to see other communities where they have tighter design requirements around their buildings and they have fewer parking spaces in them, and so people bring fewer cars. So long as you provide lots of parking, people will always bring lots of cars. And so I think part of the principle here is what we've seen in other developments around the city is fewer than one car being registered per unit in the 301 West Broad and the Lincoln at Tinner Hill, that it is possible for folks to live in the city either car light or car free. And so the principle is to take advantage of that and let's try to build sort of more housing that caters to folks who don't want to have cars or only want to have one car per household. Right, so not everyone, and this is a difference. So there's a funny number, if you like digging through census data. I don't know, I do. But there is information in the census data, and it talks about the discrepancy between auto ownership between folks who own their homes and folks who rent their homes. So for folks who are homeowners, 2/3 of those houses have 2 or more cars. And the reverse is true for folks who are renters, 2/3 have 1 or fewer cars. And actually there's a substantial percentage that has no cars. Just a couple years ago, I think DC was one of those cities that had made the list where it was cheaper to Uber everywhere you went than it was to own a car. And so there are people that are making do sort of without a car at all, just in terms of the way they live their daily life, or they have a household, even if they have 2 folks, 3 folks living in it, they've only got 1 car amongst them. Right, so there is, I mean, obviously there's street parking, and I know some folks in the room are already using the street parking, but that is one of the shared resources that's available, or visitors may choose to not come by car at all.
Hi. Each of you independently has strongly indicated that when the Planning Commission recommendations go to City Council, that they're going to say this is substantially changed and we have to start again with another first reading. Is that nailed down?
So that's everything I'm hearing from sort of my seat inside of City Hall. Of course, I'm not the one who casts the votes, but everything I'm hearing is that council would line up for a new first reading and amend their proposal. I mean, I can't tell the council what to do.
Obviously.
So I don't know what their vote will be, but that's what I understand is the sort of intention.
Okay, and second question. Given the very different characteristics between Washington and Park Avenue, what is the advantage of getting rid of T1 and T2 and consolidating to a single T-zone?
Sure. If we go to the map, yeah, it's a question that's been asked a bunch of times, that when we say, we're going to get rid of the differences, and everyone say, wait, the T-zones are different, exactly as you're saying. It's a funny thing because the only zones that are zoned sort of T2 today, there's this sort of strip of green space coming in off Gresham, which holds no development potential, and then unless you move a road, and then you've got the Kaiser building here along Park Avenue, a small professional office building on the corner here with Great Falls, and then this is the parking lot for the Park Towers condo. So they own that land, and it's the parking for the residents. So I don't see them taking away their own parking lot anytime soon. So it's yes, there are 2 districts, but the 3 or 4 things that happen to be zone T2 aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And so the thought was just go ahead and make it 1 zone for simplicity. But I think what was discovered through the process is maybe we sort of make a different use of that distinction.
Yes, that's what I was trying to hint at. That if you already have T1 and T2, you could
just make use of them.
Make use of them, right, and not consolidate and make everything subject to the same set of rules.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to follow up on her question where we were kind of asking where all this input you're getting from the city is going. And if I understand you correctly, you're merely informing us our input needs to be to the council and to the planning commission. We're not telling you anything that nothing comes out of this meeting that's used to convey what the community is thinking. Is that correct? For all the response we've seen,
right?
Which at one time I thought all issues were this big, but I've been led to believe that actually you guys have gotten a lot more attention than normal for this. So for as much response as you've gotten, the only avenue for citizens to communicate that and have an actual impact would be to, I just want to make sure that we understand.
No,
Are we talking to anybody now, or you're helping us talk to people later?
So the purpose of this, right, was to make sure there was just sort of, as clear as we can be, to provide information about what the T-zones do today, what council referred out, and then tentatively what the Planning Commission's recommendation is. So at this point, their tentative recommendation has already been published. So if you want to make comments on it, then making that comment to the Planning Commission is the right venue. I will say that we see all the comments that come in, we assemble them into the packages, we read them as we go, and it's sort of impossible to think that that doesn't influence us, right? I can't say, ooh, I saw that 7th comment, 3:30 yesterday, and now I'm really gonna take that in and ignore all the others. No, it's city staffers looking at the totality of the comments that come in, and then weighing that, sort of the balance of what's been heard and what the overall goal and sort of what's feasible in the sites. So it's a blender. It's a
I
blender.
apologize for asking the macro question, then getting back into the noise again. But we keep kind of skipping over the T part of the T zones, and you've always kind of shown us how the proposal has been negotiated back and forth.
Sure.
But you haven't really shown us physically, or really touched on physically, the 50 feet. We talk about that as 50 feet in a transition zone, but I don't think there's anything I don't think the Broadway is taller than that. It doesn't really transition, does it? I mean, it's not a transition between, it's the same height, right?
Sure. So some of this is a transition against sort of, is it a transition against what's there today or what's possible under the zoning ordinance? So if you think about sort of this side of the screen being single-family development, by right single-family development is what's called 35 feet to the midline. So you think about the new houses that have gone in along the north side of Park Avenue, not to single them out, but we're talking about Park Avenue. They sit on a high ground, so their 35 feet is already higher than the other side of Park Avenue by several feet, plus their peak is several feet above 35, so they may already be pushing 40, 45 feet at the peak of their roof. So some of these buildings may actually be smaller than what's across the street from them. And then on the other side, if you think about the Broad Street side, by right today in B1 is 55 feet by right, and with a special exception, you can go up to 85 feet. So there is, this is, by right a little bit taller than what a single-family house would be, and shorter than a by right, or certainly shorter than a special exception.
So, Paul, thank you for doing this. And thank you for you've given, and certainly me personally and a lot of others, a lot of your time to answer questions and to help work through the process, and it's very much appreciated. I would say that it's also frustrating that a lot of what we've been able to do is write letters and give 3-minute speeches. And that's not really a back and forth communication. Even though it's with you and it's not really with the policymakers. And I don't think that all the wisdom of planning is in the Planning Commission or in the City Council. I mean, when I hear the people talk here, and as I've talked to people throughout the neighborhood, there are a lot of very bright people with a lot of excellent experience who could maybe come up with plans that attack the objectives and come up with ways to do that in a way that's compatible. One of the ideas I heard today, smaller and denser homes, that would be better from the point of view of the Broadway looking over them. It would also be better from the point of view of creating affordable housing. So there may be ways to solve a lot of things. I hope that when this goes back from the Planning Commission, you as a senior planner will recommend that the City Council actually have a real back and forth townhouse that maybe you could moderate, where you could actually take some of these ideas and see if you can come up with some more creative approaches to actually address these problems.
To add to that, I'm mystified by something. We had a listening session where we talked at you on November 2nd. Well, we talked, to the Planning Commission. You got to sit on the side and hear it. No, as Fred said, no dialogue or anything. And then there's a, quote, public hearing next week, right before the Planning Commission's going to vote. How does the public hearing differ from the listening session, where I think we get to talk at the Planning Commission for 3 minutes each again? So even though you use public hearing, it's exactly like the listening session for all practical, no difference, right?
Yeah, public hearing is, so we're required to hold public hearings, and I think they serve a purpose of making sure people know what's going on. But from a community engagement standpoint, right, any community engagement class is going to tell you a public hearing is not really the time to cut a new deal, right? It's sort of, the docket is posted, the engagement's been going on for months, if not years, but you're required to hold public hearings. They serve a purpose of making sure people know. the reason for hosting the listening session early was specifically to hear ideas from folks in the community to improve the proposal as it was going through the process. And so that's why we held that's why the Planning Commission asked that work session be held early, several months before their sort of roll up the sleeves work session, so that they could take advantage of those comments and improve the proposal.
So I just want to point out, in the January 25th meeting, one unnamed council member pointed out in a subsequent meeting that, hey, the seats weren't all 15 seats weren't filled because we said there's no purpose getting anybody out there because you're going to just be in an overflow room next door. So on next Wednesday, when you don't have a crowd like this, because you have just said there's really no purpose of showing up, if I may translate what you said, because it's going to be too late to influence the process. I hope that it's not shown in the press or any place else that no one cared because you didn't get a crowd like this on February 15th, because what I heard is we can talk at people for another 3 minutes, but that's all the purpose is, right? Thanks.
No, so one of the things I always struggle with as a planner through the process, right, you typically see sort of lumps of people sort of get involved and then maybe sort of stay with the process or leave the process. And so the population of sort of who's engaged in the thing will ebb and flow. And I think this is where you've got to sort of rely on sort of the planning commissioners, the council members, the staff, that they're going to listen to the comments all the way through the process. And even when it gets to the final product, they're going to be balancing all the inputs they heard across the way, right? So I'm not just going to write down what the last person said. I'm going to think about all those comments I've heard over the last several years, and how do I make a proposal that's going to work for all those voices?
Good evening. My name is Dee Estes. I live at the at the Broadway. Is it not on? But it's on, right? Thank you. Thank you. This is the first time I've been able to attend a meeting, and I just wanted to let you know what I'm going away with. I'm glad to see a nice crowd. It seems to me like it's been just a grievance committee. And I think that's good that people share all of their concerns. But I don't see that it going anywhere but here. Am I mistaken?
It's a done deal.
Well, so this is recorded, it's being broadcast on YouTube, and so obviously I've already heard from several planning commissioners that they're going to be watching this tape before their public hearing, and then so that's going to be influencing the way they vote. And I've seen council members in the audience tonight, and I'm sure they're watching the tape as well. So, it's a little strange to me, right? And maybe that's because I sort of do these projects all the time, right? But when I go to all these sessions, when I hear all these comments, I think about them all as I'm making my recommendations.
I'm glad.
And so that's something that happens as sort of the body of sort of comment comes together. And I'm sure that the planning commissioners are listening to this as well as the council members.
And they will have heard it by next Wednesday.
Right, and remember, next Wednesday isn't the end of it, right? That they've already received hundreds of written comments, as well as the comments at the listening session and conversations they've had with folks throughout the community. And so this is really informing their recommendations back to council. But again, that's not the end of it. Council updates.
It doesn't sound like it. It just seems like that this could go around and around forever and ever, and I just don't know what has been accomplished. But I'll certainly be glad to hear what has been.
Well, you're making an attack on local democracy. This is how rules get made. People make ideas, they debate them, and they can't see if they can't make something work.
I know all about democracy. It just seems like this is, I think the Congress was, our Congress was done quicker than this. I mean, not the current Congress, for heaven's sakes. The one in 1817 or whenever that was. Thank you. Good night. I hope good night.
So with that, and I certainly don't want to cut off if anybody has any remaining questions, but since it's getting late, here, I'll bring the mic over here. Maybe we'll take like 2-3 more questions if there are any, and then maybe we'll wrap things up.
Okay, thanks. Just a point of order here. The Planning Commission does have the authority to defer their recommendation. Is that correct?
Correct. They did that actually in response to comments. They did that at their December 21st meeting. That was their advertised public hearing date. And they did, in response to comment, defer to a date certain. They deferred to February 15th.
So people should come out if they have something to say.
Sure.
And it may get to the point where the Planning Commission will hear enough new ideas that they will defer their decision.
Sure.
So don't give up, don't stay home if you have something to say. Send a letter or go and speak to them, because they still could make more changes. And these changes came out 2 days ago, 3 days ago. So a lot of us have not really had a chance to read them carefully and to understand the differences. So I think that's another reason why the Planning Commission should consider deferring their recommendation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I did just want to thank you guys again for speaking and for giving us this forum, because I do feel, as some people have pointed out, that the notifications to those in the city, as well as the opportunities to speak and to be heard, have been a little limited in this process. But thank you for providing the forum here, and thank you everyone for coming tonight, right, and actually sharing your opinions and your viewpoints. Hopefully we can make a better project with this, and I hope that those who are listening, planning commissioners, city council members who are here, will look at this as a representative body and hopefully vote accordingly. But I would also ask if the planning commission could also, in your initial proposal, you had put a picture out that kind of indicated all of the different aspects, the setbacks, the building heights, the lot coverage. And in the picture I'm seeing here, the way that it's actually proportioned and shown is it actually looks like the building heights are the same. It also shows the same lot coverage for both. So it's not really representative, and I think picture's worth 1,000 words and can help people understand what's happening. So I would ask if you guys could put that out and publish that as well.
So I just want to say thank you, echo everyone's comments. I'm so excited that so many people turned out. I moved here in 2016, and I love that I am part of a community that is so engaged and had such great questions and thoughtful comments. I also want to thank Paul and now I'm so late, Jack, because it is way past my bedtime. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and taking the time to answer everyone's questions.